That's a great question, isn't it? JFK was in his 40s when he became president. Now that millennials are starting to get to be that age, why aren't there any millennial presidents? And the answer is, of course, fucking boomers. Now, I originally wasn't going to make a video about this specifically, but then I ended up on an ADD rabbit hole, and here we are. First, before we get started, JFK is kind of a bad analog. At 43 years old, JFK was the youngest president to ever be elected. Teddy Roosevelt was, in fact, the youngest president ever at 42, but he didn't get elected initially. He became president after McKinley was assassinated. Anyway, the oldest millennials now are 43 years old, and the median age for a president at inauguration is 55. So the question really shouldn't be, why has there been no millennial presidents, and should be, why has there been no Gen X presidents? Oldest Gen X is 58. Youngest president ever elected was 43. Median age at inauguration is 55. They've been in that presidential sweet spot age for over a decade now, yet there hasn't been any. So anyway, on this ADD rabbit hole, I started scrolling through all of the presidents and looking at the year that each one was born in order. Now, it would stand to reason that every time a new president gets elected, their birth year would be later than the president they're replacing. Most of the time. After all, 4 to 8 years on average has passed since the last dude was elected. It would stand to reason that the new guy was born a few years after the last guy. So let's test that theory. Let's go back 100 years. That brings us to Calvin Coolidge, born 1872. You got Hoover, 74, FDR, 82, Truman, 84, Eisenhower, born 1890, JFK, 1917. JFK, obviously the youngest president ever elected, gets assassinated, and his vice president, LBJ, takes over. LBJ is a little bit older, 9 years to be exact, born 1908. So we take a little step back there, but LBJ wasn't elected. The next president was Richard Nixon, again, born after the previous president in 1913. He resigns over a scandal that today would just be a random Tuesday, and his vice president takes over, also born 1913. And then we get to Jimmy Carter, 1924. So the 10 presidents we've been through so far, 8 of them were elected into the presidency, and all 8 of those elected to office were physically younger than their predecessor. Now you're probably saying, there's been lots of presidents since Carter, why'd you stop there? And I didn't stop, I just paused because the trend changes, because everything wrong in the world starts with our next president, Ronald Reagan. Reagan, elected in 1980, was born in 1911. Not only was he born before his predecessor, Jimmy Carter, he was born 6 years before John F. Kennedy, who was elected in 1961. When Ronald Reagan left office, he was the oldest president in history. The next president is Reagan's VP, Daddy Bush, who was born in 1924. And while he was younger than Reagan, he was a couple months older than Jimmy Carter, who had been elected 12 years earlier. This brings us to 1992. Bill Clinton, born 1946, is our very first boomer president and one of the youngest presidents ever elected at 46 years old. Hey, Reagan Bush was a fluke. The pendulum swung back, right? 8 years later, we get Baby Bush, and he was also a boomer, born in 1946. Then we get Barack Obama, who is considerably younger, but born in 1961, is still a boomer. Don't worry, guys, though, that was just a fluke, because next we get Donald J. Trump, who is also a boomer, born in, guess what? 1946. So the 4 presidents between 1992 and 2016 were all baby boomers. And 3 of them were the first model year boomers, born June, July, and August of 1946, getting older. Clinton was the fucking youngest. Don't worry, guys, the next president, Biden, not a boomer. Born in 1942, he's fucking silent gen. Joe Biden is physically older than the president we elected 30 fucking years ago. Let this sink in. I'm 32 years old. The president elected in the first presidential election of my lifetime who is still physically alive is younger than the current president of the United States. Back to the original question is, why has there been no millennial presidents, or more accurately, why has there been no Gen X presidents? And the answer is that the boomers in Washington are too narcissistic, self-absorbed, selfish, and power-hungry to retire. And it's taking them an eternity to get into the forever box. They leave absolutely no room for younger people to move up into higher political positions. This isn't just the White House. The average age of the Senate is 65 and a half years old, and the average age of Congress is 58 and a half years old. And younger people are running against these people and trying to get a hold on the reins of power to help guide our country for the people who are our own fucking age. But it makes it really hard because they're running against people with more name recognition because they've been there for half a fucking century, they've got more money, and they've got more connections. It's really hard to defeat incumbents, and parties will almost never throw their support behind a newcomer if they have an incumbent to run, which is why we need term limits and a maximum age on public officials. But this doesn't just affect Washington. In corporate America, boomers boomers refusing to retire is one of the many, oh so goddamn many financial obstacles facing Gen X, millennials, and now Gen Z. Because once again, they got into these mid and higher level positions and organizations and then just never fucking leave. So there's never any room for younger people to move up into better paying positions. Sorry, this video got long. I was just gonna talk about how since Reagan, our presidents have progressively gotten like older, and then obviously I got carried away. Back to the initial point, we absolutely should have had a Gen X president by now and have some millennials that are at least on a short list to primary in 2024 or 2028, and we don't because boomers will never retire or die.